Don't talk. Poor Maid saved billionaire lady after catching her husband's dark scheme. The taxi led her out at a gate taller than any she had ever seen, a black spine of metal against a sky the color of dishwater. The driver waited, watching her count bills with shaking hands. He did not offer a word of luck. She kept one last bill and folded it into her shoe, a little soft corner of hope that made her limp a bit as she stepped toward the camera eye. A camera turned with a soft electric sigh, a speaker crackled, a man's voice, smooth as new lacquer, filled the space between the bars. You are expected. Step forward. Please. No chatter. The gate did not swing open. It yawned, slow and heavy. She walked under it and felt the weight of it slide behind her with a greeting that sounded like a lock. Inside the fence, the air was different. Gardens clipped to perfection nodded at her, dark fountains whispered to themselves, and everywhere the slow sweep of cameras followed her in tiny silver arcs. A uniformed guard approached, palm up, smiling. He took her bag and handed her a laminated card. He placed a finger gently on his lips and then pointed beyond his shoulder. Above a side door a sign hung, simple and white, with letters black as soot. A rule in plain quotation: do not open any door unless it opens for you. Do not stray from your route. And at the top, centered, a line that shone like a boundary: do not talk. The words were not loud, but they rang through the courtyard, like a bell she would hear in her bones. She nodded because that seemed allowed. The guard's smile broadened with relief and he led her in. The floors were stone, cool under her thin shoes, and the walls held pictures that did not need gilt frames to be worth a fortune. The smell of the house was lemon and polish, and a faint whisper of chlorine from water that lay somewhere out of sight. Every door had a glass bead-size light above its handle, a sleepy eye. Some of them flicked green when the guard's hand hovered near, others stayed red and the guard did not even glance. In a room as white as the sign, a folded uniform sat waiting. On the folded shirt a small earpiece bristled with nerves like a cricket. The housekeeper, a woman with a tidy bun, and a face that did not know smile lines, stepped close and showed the maid how to clip the little thing to her ear. You will hear what you need, the woman said, her voice slow. You will not answer unless asked. Above all, do not talk. The old rule has its reasons. The maid nodded again. The uniform fit her like it had expected her a long time ago. She smoothed the fabric and felt the tug of fear and hunger at the same time. Rent lingered like a storm cloud over her tiny room in a neighborhood that smelled like fried oil and hot metal. A debt for medicine sat on her shoulders like a child who would not let go. She had promised her own mother, eyes damp at the kitchen table, that she would survive anything so long as the money came. The husband appeared on a screen in the wall, his face as handsome as a printed ad. Welcome, he said, as if speaking into her ear alone. We keep a smooth rhythm here. Doors will open for you. Schedules arrive by the hour. Do not worry about what you do not understand. The people, before you follow the rhythm, you will too. And then, as warm as a blanket in winter, he said, I am glad you are here. The screen went black. The housekeeper's eyes snapped to the maid's. The nod returned, clipped and professional. When the earpiece ticked, the maid jumped, and the housekeeper hid a small smile like a secret, quick and gone. Her first route traced itself in her ear. Hall, gallery, guest rooms, laundry. She moved, lightly, and the doors did their trick. A soft click, the light shifted, and the handle begged her fingers. When she stood before a door that stayed red, she stood, hands quiet, until her ear told her to move on. The house taught obedience with gentle patience, like a tutor tapping a lesson into slow fingers. She saw the lady mid-morning, solitary, at the far end of a glass-walled sunroom that looked over water. A book lay open in her lap, her fingers resting like pale leaves on its pages. A cup of tea sat on a tray beside her, untouched except for the lipstick print that seemed like a bruise. A nurse hovered, attentive, watching the slight sway of the lady's head. The eyes that lifted to meet the maid's were intelligent under a film the color of fog. The maid paused with the duster in her hand. She had grown used to dropping her gaze around people who owned walls like these. But the lady looked at her, and for a moment the fog thinned and the person inside showed. A little flicker of monsoon behind a window. The maid felt a pull. A long echo from nights in a clinic waiting room where she had learned the language of eyes when mouths were too afraid to move. Do not talk, breathed the earpiece. The nurse's glance was quick and sharp, The maid dipped her head and dusted in silence. The lady's hand trembled, and the book slid off her lap. The maid moved, automatic, to catch it before it hit the floor. The cover brushed her fingers. She lifted it back, and in the slow act of returning it, she saw the small beads of pill dust glittering faint on the rim of the teacup, like sugar that never dissolved. The nurse noticed her noticing. The maid felt it as a change in the air, the way one feels heat before the sun arrives. She let her gaze slide to the window. Instead, to the glitter of the pool, that was so still it looked like glass, laid flat. That afternoon she watched the house breathe. The husband did not appear in person. His presence existed in little clicks and soft orders. Doors that were not hers did not open until his voice murmured through someone's ear. The kitchen staff moved like a flock that had been trained to fly in formation, trays aligned, voices only when the earpieces allowed them. In a hallway, a gardener lifted his elbow in greeting, quickly dropped it, and pointed to his ear with a grin that said, "This is the only mouth we have here." A guest arrived, a woman with hair like satin. The front door parted as if to bow. In the entry, the husband materialized at last, contradiction and charm, his laugh filling the high ceiling. His hand warmed the guest's arm, his gaze flitted to the cameras as if they too required a compliment. The staff became shadows. The maid stood half hidden behind a potted tree, holding a silver tray she did not have to carry, pretending to arrange leaves. He was beautiful at being kind. He asked after journeys, he praised fabrics and scent, but every time a staff member crossed his path, his eyes flicked to a watch, and something in the air corrected itself. A server's pace quickened without a word. A door opened before a guest even reached it. He had the house in his hand, and the house thanked him with each click and sigh. When the guests disappeared, the staff returned to straight lines. The maid delivered supper to the sunroom. The nurse measured drops into tea. The scent was floral and cloying. The lady's hand struggled with the spoon, slipped, then stopped moving entirely, as if she had decided to be still to keep from breaking. The maid had never been a talker, not even in the neighborhood where gossip ran along stoops as fast as rain gutters overflow. Silence had been a strategy, a way to listen for danger. Here, silence felt different. It had rules that hummed and buzzed. It had doors that inhaled when you approached and exhaled when you obeyed. In the staff room that night, she lay on a narrow bed with her shoes at the foot, worrying the seam where she had tucked her bill away. She stared at the ceiling where the light was already off and thought about the lady's eyes. Eyes that wanted out of a fog. She thought about sugar that would not melt, about a laugh that oiled every hinge in the house. Her earpiece slept on the metal tray beside the bed. Even resting, she felt its ghost in her ear. A command, in absentia, do not talk. It wore a coat of kindness here, people calling it wisdom and order, but it pressed on her tongue all the same. In the dark, she decided she would carry the rule like a cloak in the halls. She would tuck it around her shoulders and draw no attention. But she did not promise herself she would be deaf. She would listen to the hum in the walls, to the way people walked, and the way the lady breathed, to the timing of locks, and the whisper of clean sheets. She would learn the rhythm that obeyed that warm voice on the screen. She would memorize the spots where the powder caught the light. The next morning, before the sky had fully uncurled, the house would wake to the schedule that kept it perfect. The maid would wake too, to the small weight of a bill in her shoe, and a rule that filled the hallways without ever raising its tone. What she would not know yet was how a rule like that, once questioned, grew teeth. She only knew hunger, and a glassy calm that felt like a spell. And somewhere in the quiet, a hand with a ring clicked a watch and opened another door. The day began like silk, stretched over a bruise. The morning staff moved in quiet lines, polishing the shine already gleaming, arranging fresh flowers that did not need arranging, and checking the little screens that ran the house like a measured heartbeat. She went where she always went, to the high corridors and cool rooms where her footsteps made no sound, past the tall glass that turned the gardens into a painting, toward the private wing where the lady preferred sunlight and calm. The house spoke in gentle chimes when anything moved. It was a music one could forget, like breathing. So when a harsh beeping chopped through the air near the indoor balcony, her head turned before she could think. A light on the safety panel flashed a clinical red. The railing along the balcony shivered as if it were cold, then gave a tiny jerk inward, a stutter that would have gone unseen if not for the lady brushing her hand along it as she passed. There was a warning on the screen. A single word. Malfunction. The lady laughed softly to the small dog trotting by her ankle, a laugh of someone long used to tiny errors in a machine-filled life. Her palm slid along the rail. The dog lifted its head. The maid's eyes saw more than laughter. The rail dipped, then caught. It came alive for a breath like a thing breathing its last. Something inside it had been loosened or cut. The maid crossed the marble before her thoughts caught up. She reached the lady's elbow, felt the delicate bones under skin, and guided her back as the rail gave one final twitch, and then settled as silent as before. Servos somewhere clicked in apology. The light on the panel softened from red to green, with an obedient blink. It had not been a real fall. It had not been a scream or a siren. Yet the scene steadied in the maid's mind as an almost that could have been an ending. The lady smiled, thanked her in that absent way of a person taught to smile as diplomacy, and moved on to the sunroom, oblivious to the way the maid stared at the panel, at the hidden seam in the railing where a tiny screw cap glinted new against old metal. Later, while delivering the breakfast tray, the maid saw the cart. The rolling cabinet stood beside the dresser, tidy as a ward in a private clinic. Clear blister packs lay in their rows, labeled in crisp letters, foil backing smooth and bright. A gentle smell of alcohol and citrus cleaner drifted up with the scent of toast. She was not supposed to touch anything on that cart. She dusted the handles anyhow, cloth flicking against steel. Her eye caught something that did not belong. One blister had a faint crescent on the foil, a silvered smile pressed and then smoothed. Another's pill sat slightly off in its pocket, not aligned to the others. The foil had a tiny ripple beside the seal where a fingernail might have pried for just a second. When the lady's companion came in, a woman who kept charts and spoke in soothing rhythms, the maid asked about water, whether the pills should be taken with juice or tea. The question came out as harmless chatter. The companion said tea was fine, and moved on. The maid's mouth felt dry. She waited until the corridor was empty, and began, with the caution of a person covering dust with a drop of spit, to ask one person here and there about storage, about cupboard temperatures, about whether a blister pack could ever be resealed by mistake. The gardener shrugged and smiled. The chef said nothing, but his eyes flicked to the cameras on the ceiling, and his hands moved faster. By mid-morning the air felt heavier. She kept seeing that stutter in the rail, that almost fall rewritten by careful machines, and the neat row of pills ready to be swallowed without thought. It was all small. Too small to be a story anyone would listen to. Too small to matter until a small thing turned into a very large grief. She rounded the corner toward the back stairs, away from the hum and polish of the main hall. The laundry room door stood ajar, warm, smelling of steam and lemon. She slid in and closed it behind her to breathe. A shadow cut the light before she turned. He stepped in like a man stepping onto his own stage, the husband in his tailored ease, the smile that cost nothing and bought everything. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He looked down at her, as if she were a smudge on a glass he was about to clean. Then he smiled wider, a gentle spread of lips that did not reach his eyes. He leaned a fraction closer, palms braced on the folding table, as if discussing something boring and simple. "You have questions," he said, as if he were teasing a child. Her tongue went heavy. She did not answer. "I like a curious mind," he went on, eyes shining with friendly light that threw no warmth. "It can be useful. It can also be noisy. And noise makes a house unpleasant." Something in his tone wrapped around her throat. Her hands found the comfort of the damp cotton sheets still warm from the press, knuckles whitening. She thought of the dog, the lady's soft thank you, the raw edge on that foil. She thought of how often a mistake begins small. He came closer still, the faint scent of expensive cologne, and sour something beneath it. His gaze flicked over her shoulder to the little camera in the corner, and then back. He tilted his head like a man considering art. "Do me a favor," he said, almost tender. He tapped a finger once against his own lips, then let his smile grow bright and empty. "Don't talk." The words hung between them like a fine wire. The laundry machines whirred and hummed, pretending not to hear. Somewhere in the house something chimed to announce a door opening. The maid's heart beat against her ribs like a bird. He straightened and left her in that humming room with the echo of his smile. She stood very still and then felt the tremor start in her hands, the spill of fear through her limbs. It would be the easiest thing to do, as he had said. It would be the safest. Silence had kept her alive before. Silence had kept her fed and sheltered, hidden inside the machinery of other people's wealth. But when she stepped back into the hall, the sunlight did not look the same. The railing along the balcony caught the light in a way that made her stomach twist. The cart in the bedroom waited with its little doses of calm and sleep, and whatever else the labels promised. The lady's laughter traveled down the corridor, oblivious, sweet, trusting. The maid looked down at her own hands. They were the hands of a person taught to carry trays and wash crystal and keep quiet. They were also the hands that had reached without thinking to pull someone back from a fall that had almost happened and was not meant to be a mistake. She smoothed her apron. She set her face into the blank politeness that had always fit her like a second skin. Inside that blankness, something hard began to take shape. He could keep his smile. He could keep his cameras. He could hold his soft threat in the air like perfume. She would not talk where he could hear. She would not make noise that could be erased. She would watch. She would count without numbers. She would carry a memory of the ripple in the foil and the red blink on the panel, and she would find the seams where the truth had been smoothed over. And when the moment came that the house's gentle chimes turned into alarms, it would not be by accident. The first whisper came from the wall itself, a moth-wing tremor behind the wallpaper where ivy vines curled across painted plaster. While dusting the corridor that led from the drawing room to the study, the maid felt the bristles of her brush catch on something not quite flat. She pressed her ear to the cool paper and heard a soft hiss, as if the house had secrets it could not keep to itself. Hidden there, small as a coin, a metal grill lay flush with the trim. It was old, it was quiet, and it was alive. That night, while the staff slept in their tucked-away rooms and the lady's wing glowed faint as a lantern in fog, the maid tested another panel, then another, in the pantry, behind a row of jars, in the music room, tucked beneath a carved shelf, in the guest hall, above a light switch. She spoke once, and got only static, then hummed, and heard her own tune come back, thin and delayed. The mansion had bones that still carried voices to places eyes could not reach. The house had newer eyes too, discreet glass pupils in the ceiling corners, a sleek screen in the den that showed a grid of rooms, a clever system that recorded lights and doors and breaths of air, all captured in neat little notes. The maid learned the rhythm of those eyes. She watched where they blinked during vacuuming, where a spray of sunlight foxed the lens, where a marble bust cut out a wedge of blind floor. She kept a mental map of these shadows, a way to pass from one wing to another under the gaze of 1,000 quiet watchers. The first note she slid beneath the lady's saucer said only, "Do not talk." The second said, "Watch me." At breakfast the lady raised her eyes, then dropped them to the table with such practiced grace that no one would have noticed. But the maid saw how the fingers shaking sugar into tea paused when the word "do not" rose from the paper like a moth from a jar. She saw how the lady's shoulders went still. Gesture became language. A napkin folded to a point meant danger. A napkin smoothed meant a calm day. Sleeves tugged, then released, meant the attendant in the corridor was listening. A cup turned clockwise meant the husband was in the house. That first morning the maid stood at the sideboard, the silver glinting like small mirrors around her hands, and lifted her chin as if at a thought. Only the lady was watching. A tiny nod answered back, half a blink. In the sultry hush that follows the breakfast hour, in that drifting time when the house begins to count the minutes until noon, the lady pressed her lips to the grill near her vanity. The maid was by the door, dusting the carved frame as if the chisel marks were the only interesting thing in the world. The whisper came through so thin she almost thought she made it up. "My head is not my own," the lady breathed. "The pills come every night. I swallow them because he watches, then fog, then nothing. I cannot remember what he says. I wake, with a taste like tin, and a smile that feels borrowed." The maid did not answer out loud. She let her duster fall. From the hallway, she tugged her sleeve twice. The lady paused, then set her hairbrush down and breathed again, more words leaking through the years-old wired artery. "I'm afraid I am losing days," she said. "He calls what he brings vitamins," says the doctor insists. "I want to trust him. The world outside this house trusts him. But I look in the mirror and I cannot count how many evenings have slipped." In the laundry, behind the hum of machines, the maid began to collect proof. From the kitchen trash she pulled out a receipt with a pharmacy logo slicked with coffee, small charges for compounds and tranquil blends. In the office nook she found a printout that should not have been left there, a smart system log that showed lights in the lady's suite dimming at the same hour each night, the bedside tablet waking for an instant. A medicine cabinet sensor noting open and close. She did not need the exact times. The repetition told its own story. In the security room, a guard had left a screen glowing. The maid stood with a spray bottle and cloth, and watched the grid while pretending to clean. The stair camera looped, a brief flutter of black, when it jumped from one image to the next. At that flutter, a person could pass. She brought her cloth close to the lens and counted breaths under it, her chest rising slow and steady until she knew the length of the blink by the burn of her lungs. Later, she used that blind instant to cross the landing with a folded bill of paper pressed flat under her palm. She built a ledger in hiding, receipts flattened under a cutting board, edges aligned with the wood grain, system logs downloaded on a borrowed phone, then transcribed by hand on pastry parchment so they would look like recipes if discovered. Timestamps copied one after another, not for their numerals but for their pattern, a list of identical intervals that made her skin prickle. She sealed these in a sleeve she stitched from an old apron, slid the sleeve into the hollow base of her mop bucket where a cracked wheel gave it just enough space. At dinner, the husband lifted a glass and joked about the weight of the day, the weight of fortune, the weight of being seen. He kissed the lady's temple and set a pill case by her plate as though it were a kindness. The maid watched, eyes down. The lady's hand hovered over the case, then went still. The maid lifted a platter and adjusted a spoon so its handle lay north, their sign that they were not alone. No word was said. When the house settled, when even the clock seemed to yawn, the maid crept along the blind edge behind the tall grandfather that did not work, and found another wall grill in the small library no one visited. She breathed into it with her mouth closed, the sound a little rush like a shell held to the ear. A reply came, thin and metallic. "He says the pills are for sleep." The lady whispered. "He says I worry too much. When I do not take them, he is kind until he is not." And then the world swims and my memory goes soft at the edges. The maid slid her fingers into the seam of the bookcase and felt a tiny switch. The old intercom crackled clearer. Words moved between the walls like river water, glinting and gone. "Do not talk here," the maid murmured, barely shaping the sounds. "We have notes, we have eyes. We will use what the house uses against us." So the lady began to tuck slivers of paper into places that were hers alone. Inside the gloves she wore for the garden. Beneath the powder box lid where a light layer of pale dust would hide the presence of a message. Under a coaster in the conservatory where the rich ferns breathed damp air, each paper held one bright bead of memory. The arrival of a courier with an unmarked box. A conversation she could not recall, marked only by the echo of a raised voice and a colder smile. A nap she did not intend to take, awaking with the sun lower than it should have been. With each new piece, the maid's ledger grew, receipts made a trail, logs formed a waveform of control, timestamps, stripped of their digits, stacked like fence posts across the length of a day. In the pantry, while the cook banged pots and the radio muttered a tune, the maid traced it with a finger. He dimmed the lights, he opened the cabinet. The bedside screen woke, the hall camera blinked. The bedroom camera cut out for the length of 2 deep breaths. The door opened and closed with no one recorded. The lady slept. On a cloudless afternoon, the maid found a set of tiny screw holes in the baseboard near the lady's nightstand, small and neat where a device could have Saturday. The nightstand itself had a faint ring on its polished top, as if a charger had lived there for a long time and was recently removed. She dabbed the ring with oil and watched the light slide across it. Someone had cleaned quickly. Someone had tried to erase. She placed the latest note beneath the lady's tea saucer. A line of ink, small as a hair. "We will keep our minds," she wrote. "We will keep what is ours." The saucer moved. The lady's hand settled atop it. Her eyes lifted to the maid, then away, as if glancing at the ceiling fixture. Only then did the maid realize the fixture itself hid a modern microphone among the crystals. The maid smiled to nothing in particular, and refilled the sugar bowl. That night the house murmured like a harbor. The maid stood in the doorway of her narrow room and listened to the walls breathe. She had seen the pattern and it frightened her, but fear could be a map if you learned its contours. She reached under the bed and touched the stitched apron sleeve, then slid it back into place. The intercom hissed, then steadied. The lady's voice traveled to her, a ribbon of sound through wires older than either of them. "I am still here," the lady whispered. "I will not forget tonight. Do not talk, not where he can hear. Tomorrow, We make a bigger pocket for the truth. The maid pressed her fingertips to the grill. Tomorrow, she breathed. The house was listening. Let it hear. The brooch was not hers. It gleamed from the cuff of her apron like a cold eye, catching the light as if it had been waiting there all along. She stared at it, at the velvet pouch half tucked into the fold, at the tiny clasp she had handled only once when the lady asked her to return it to the safe. Around her, the staff corridor shrank into whispers and sidelong glances. The house manager looked sick with triumph, as if finally a piece had slid into place. By the time they pulled open the pocket on her cleaning cart, the bottle rattled with unfamiliar pills, pasty white instead of the usual honeyed capsules. Someone made a sound between a gasp and a gulp. Someone else murmured that the lady had been sleeping through meals, that her hands shook this morning. I did not, she tried to say, but her throat tightened. The husband appeared without footsteps, silk and steel, a calm so cool it felt rehearsed. He stood at a distance, watching her face, watching the bottle, and then he turned to the manager with the kind of sigh that sounds like restraint. It would be better, he said, if she were removed quietly. No scandal, no police. That was mercy, he said, for a girl who had betrayed the house. They took her elbow, not hard, not gentle. She thought of the lady upstairs, her hair brushed till it shone, her laughter small but present, when the maid plucked a mist feather from the hem of a shawl. The lady did not like the heavy pills. She would press her tongue to the roof of her mouth and make a face, and the maid would switch them for the tiny blue ones that calmed without turning the day cloudy. The bottle in the cart was not what the doctor ordered. It was heavier. It would press down, until the world itself bent. As they ferried her toward the service elevator, she said she needed the restroom. They shook their heads, then nodded, then waited with the door propped open, and their impatience tapping like rain against a window. She went in, and did not turn on the light. The window was a rectangle of night, the air cool. She had been cleaning corners of this house for long enough to know the seams behind the walls, the pocket spaces. She opened the utility hatch and slipped into that slim breath of darkness, flattened herself between pipes and wire conduits, and traced the path she had run only in drills of fear and instinct. Her shoes whispered on the back stair. Cameras panned in blind routines. She knew their arcs from long polishing. The hum of the server room came up through the floor like a steady pulse. The night guard sat in the glow of monitors, a paper cup of coffee cooling on the desk. He was one of the few who saw her when she was invisible. He was the kind who noticed if her hands were shaking and held the door a beat longer on bad weather days. When he saw her slip in from the maintenance hatch, his mouth opened and closed. Then he dragged the chair forward like a shield. "You cannot be here," he said, and his voice dropped as his eyes flicked to the cameras. She held up the bottle with the new pills and shook it once, just enough to make the sound. She placed it gently beside the keyboard. She pointed to the monitors, then to her chest, then to the ceiling. "Do not talk," her hand said. "Please, listen." He hesitated, then nodded once, the tiniest movement. He closed the door, switched the camera to a loop, and handed her a notepad. She wrote in spidery letters, heart racing. "Wrong medicine. Jewelry planted. He wants me gone." He looked from the words to her face. His pen hovered. "Who wants you gone?" She tore the page, crumpled it. She wrote instead, "Husband wants her declared unfit. Then he takes everything. Then an accident." The word sat between them like a blade. He reached for the drawer and took out a small drive, an old one he kept for movies, he said once. He hesitated again, then slotted it into a port and started typing, fast and neat, a man who had kept his own counsel for years. The screens shifted. File directories breathed open. The house had a digital body. He was touching its spine. They cloned the storage. Yes. But more than that, they hunted for the thread that would tie everything. He searched security logs while she scanned messages in a folder that should have been restricted, eyes darting over subject lines that tasted of law and threat. There it was, a draft letter to a private clinic known for issuing gentle certainties about decay, a scheduled appointment for a cognitive evaluation, an attached note reminding the recipient to ensure clarity regarding diminished capacity. There was a proposed transfer of proxy, a draft of a press release framing it as a compassionate measure. There were calendar entries with times blocked in iron grey, and beside them, in a message to a contractor, a line that made her cold. The balcony rail must be restored to original aesthetic. Subtlety is key, full discretion. She clicked on a bundle of images. Blueprints of the penthouse glowed with annotations. Someone had marked a section of terrace with a little star. Below, a note to the house manager about moving the ladies' appointments out of the way for a few days due to maintenance. In another thread, private investigators reported on the maid's finances, her mother's clinic bills, the way poor turns you into a target. A separate folder held an inventory list where the brooch had been logged as present in the safe. A new line showed it missing with a timestamp, bearing the hour she started her shift. She could almost see the husband's fingers, gloved in invisible power, opening the safe, smiling at the surveillance blind spot he had ordered during interior renovations. The guard watched her face go white and put a hand on her shoulder for a heartbeat. He opened surveillance feeds that were not on the regular rotation. He pulled up a view of the private elevator that served only the top floor. The husband appeared in crisp footage, entering the lady's suite while she slept in a chair by the window. Time blurred. He exited with a velvet pouch tucked under his arm that matched the one now sitting like a curse on the maid's cart. The guard saved the clips to the drive. He copied the drafts, the letters, the plans. He paused over an email where a lawyer confirmed that once an incompetency hearing was on the books, the husband's rights over her shares could be accelerated by a particular clause in the trust. The word accident floated again in a message between the husband and a fixer, wrapped in quotes as if even he knew it was a lie, wearing a smile. The fixer replied that falls were clean, pool slips cleaner, and that grief had a pattern that no court could prosecute. In the hallway, a radio crackled. The tone of the voices changed, from bored to alert. Someone had noticed the maid was no longer at the elevator. The guard removed the drive and pressed it into her palm. His hand lingered, not pleading, not commanding, only asking her to survive the next hour. He pointed to the emergency staircase that led to the service pantry by the ladies' rooms. He would hold them off. He would say the lights flickered. He would show them an empty corridor. He tipped his cup into the wastebasket, smeared coffee on the floor with his shoe, the mess of an emergency. She tucked the drive into the hem of her apron and crossed the hum of the servers to the hatch. She moved as if her bones remembered how to be smoke. In the pantry, the scent of lemon oil and linen wrapped her. The suite beyond was dim. The lady slept on her chaise, a book face down on her lap. The kind of sleep that looks too heavy to be natural. On the table sat the small crystal glass the maid had washed that morning. The new pills lurked inside the bottle on the tray like errors blessed by label and prescription. She knelt and touched the lady's wrist, counted breaths with her own slow pulse, felt the fight still there, faint but present. When the lady's eyes opened, clouded and soft, the maid raised a finger to her lips. Do not talk. She held up the drive. Across the suite, a shadow moved toward the door. The husband's voice drifted down the hall, silk over stone, already composing sympathy. The maid slipped the drive into the hollow base of the vase where she hid spare keys and pressed the lady's hand once, a promise sealed in silence. The night hums with the quiet machinery of the house. In the soft lamplight of the service pantry, the maid lines the bottles up like chess pieces and whispers to them as if they can answer back. You will not take her. You will not take her mind. She drags a thumbnail along the seam of a foil pack, careful, deliberate, patient, the way she was taught to fold linens without a wrinkle that gives her away. The tablets cradled inside are the wrong weight, too soft to be what they pretend to be. The husband had been smart about it, smart enough to keep it just below alarm, a slow drift toward a fog that made the lady nod and smile and sign papers without reading them. She has found the truth inside the trash, inside the receipts, in the residue caught under a cap. She knows how he will insist that wealth needs guardians, that she asked for help because she could not sleep. He will talk about stress, about schedules, about propriety. He will talk and talk until silence swallows anyone who questions him. He will insist they settle it in the panic room where no signal can leak and no one can eavesdrop. He calls it safe talk, the kind where fear sits on the other side of an armored door and cannot quite get in. She sets the tampered pack aside and takes the travel kit she found hidden in a silk bag at the back of a drawer. The old label has a pharmacist's neat loops, a date from before the fog began. The smell of the tablets in the good bottle is different. She tests one with the barest touch to the tip of her tongue. Clean, bitter, true. She has done this risk like prayer. She swabs the edges of the foil with a drop of glue and fits each good tablet in the places where the others sat like eggs in a nest. No new crease, no misaligned edge. She slides the reassembled packs back into the bottle the husband's people think is theirs, then returns the decoy bottle to its shelf exactly as it was. Her hands shake after, but not with fear. She takes the tampered tablets and pours them into a glass jar, with a lid that seals tight. Evidence. The word grows teeth in her mouth. She tucks the jar behind cleaning fluid, under the sink, where no one but a maid would reach. The fog will lift. The lady's eyes will clear. The lady will look at her own reflection, and recognize the stranger who has been living in her skull and say no more. A switch has to be set. The maid takes the cheap phone she bought with tips and hides it in a carton of bleach powder. The screen is dim and unremarkable. On that dull glow she builds a net. She attaches photographs of the altered label, a short video of her fingertip scraping the chalky residue from the lip of the cap, scans of account transfers with routing lines blacked for privacy but names untouched. She writes an email addressed to the board and to a handful of reporters whose curiosity has kept them hungry through 100 other stories. She writes the subject in plain words that will make an assistant open it. She schedules it to send with a condition only she can undo, a dead man's switch hidden under a daily ritual. If she does not wake in time to touch the screen and type a single word, if something prevents her from reaching here, the house will wake to a storm. She sets copies to print from a wireless device tucked under the laundry counter, the pages spooling into a basket, then hides those pages beneath the false bottom she built with cardboard and tape. In her pocket lies a tiny microphone no bigger than a coin, wrapped in cloth. It does not speak to the house network, and it does not seek a tower. It simply listens and remembers. Off the grid, off the husband's control. She holds it in her palm until it is warm, then hides it in a tea tin, and walks quiet corridors until she is outside the door that disappears into the woodwork. The panic room breathes a little different than the hallway around it, as if it is a throat that has forgotten how to swallow. She has scrubbed that threshold, dusted that keypad, learned its patience. The husband calls it the one place you can say what you mean without fear of it being twisted. She lifts a panel in the baseboard near the meeting table inside, a panel that has always sat loose since the contractors left. 2 centimeters of darkness is all she needs. She tucks the microphone into the gap and presses the panel back. Its tiny light winks once, then darkens. If a conversation blooms here, it will be a flower pressed between pages, preserved without oxygen, waiting to be opened in sunlight. Off network, off his map. She moves to the ladies' room. The curtains are half drawn. The sea beyond the windows is a slab of ink. On the bed, the lady lies curled on her side, breathing the way someone breathes when their body is working on poison. The maid touches her wrist, feels pulse. She leaves a glass of water, a clean pill, not the one the husband wants in her. When the lady swallows, the swallow is slow, like a boat, lifting over a low wave. The maid smooths the sheet. She leans close and whispers, "There will be a moment when your head is yours again. It will come like a door opening in a long hallway. When that door swings, you do not run into the light yelling. You say only this." She puts the words in the lady's mouth in the same gentle way she used to coax her to taste soup. She repeats them until the lady can whisper them back around cotton and sleep. "Thank you for your care. I am taking advice. I was given medication that did not match the prescription. I will be handling decisions myself for now. For all matters, speak to my office. I will make a statement after a review. Simple, flat, unarguable, nothing more." The husband thrives when there are extra words to twist. Do not give him rope. They rehearse without fully waking. The maid holds her hand. Between breaths, the lady murmurs, then sleeps again. The maid sits in the chair by the window and watches the sky consider changing. She imagines the husband's face when the lady asks to schedule a safe talk in the panic room. The request will sound like surrender, an olive branch shaped exactly the way he likes it. In that room he will lay out, lie after lie, caged in the belief that the walls keep him clean. He will not think about a tiny ear in the baseboard that cares only for memory. Before she leaves the room, the maid writes a note in the lady's handwriting asking for a quiet conversation with privacy. She sets the note on the desk where the husband will see it first. A small lure, a fishhook baited with politeness. Then she folds a shawl and sets it on the back of the chair so when the lady wakes, her fingers will find something soft to ground her. She stashes the tampered pills deeper under the sink. She checks the bleach carton for the phone glow and touches the screen, once, To learn the dance she must keep repeating. The house sleeps, pretending nothing is different. Pipes knock. A cat crosses the marble like a stealth idea. She moves through it all, with a basket at her hip, a servant with nothing but routine on her mind. What she carries are the beginnings of thunderheads. The plan fits inside her like the rhythm of a song learned without hearing it, only feeling it in her bones. When the fog lifts, there will be a voice that is not afraid, and there will be proof waiting, and there will be no need to shout. The truth is a quiet thing if you let it breathe. She pauses beneath a painting of a ship and touches the frame. There has always been a sea in this house, the tide of money, the pull of old names, the undertow of secrets. She is small beside it, a speck of salt, a hand in a glove, yet the ocean changes when a pebble falls into it. She closes her eyes and lets the image settle. Then she opens them and goes to work. The masks glimmered like trapped moons under the chandelier, feathers and lacquer and glass catching the slow drift of lights. A string ensemble breathed a soft tide through the ballroom, and every movement was silk and calculation. It was the kind of night that pretended to be about charity, though those who mattered in that room were measuring power, not kindness. At the center of it all, the lady of the house stood poised on steps of stone that curved like a smile. The mask she wore was pale as an aigrette, a delicate thing that drew the gaze upward to eyes, too often filmed with a fog she could not name. Tonight, the fog had begun to lift. Hours earlier, behind a locked door and a mirror, she had taken the pills laid out in a neat little row. They looked identical to the ones that had dulled her voice and blunted her mind. They were not. A careful switch, a risk taken with shaking hands by the only person in that mansion who still spoke to her as if she were more than a signature. Warmth spread through her, a clarity like rain rinsing the smoke from a city. Across the room, a figure in a dark mask cut through the guests with a predator's ease. The husband did not lag or glance back. Security trailed him with the training of men who knew how to vanish behind pillars and potted palms. He had arranged this night like a last page being turned. There would be a toast, a procession of documents, a swapping of titles and trusteeship cloaked in flattery. Then the empire would be his to steer, while the woman who built it smiled, and signed, and receded into a curated fragility. In the service corridor, beyond the hush of moneyed voices, a young maid adjusted the black ribbon at her neck, and smoothed an apron that still bore the crease of the laundry press. She had no mask more elaborate than her plain paper oval, but her gaze was as bright as a blade. She checked the little transmitter hidden in her pocket. She listened to static, then to the soft click that meant the hidden microphone was live to the building. The panic room had always been wired to broadcast to a single secure channel, a feature meant for rescue teams. It had never before been bridged to the heart of the house. She breathed once, twice, and then sent the lure. A tiny alert flashed to a device in a pocket of a tailored jacket. Unauthorized access detected, vault code looped. The screen pulsed red in the husband's palm. He froze for an instant. He lifted his chin and smiled at a senator. He excused himself, his voice a velvet glove. He stepped through an oak door behind the dais and into a corridor lit with hospital clarity. The panic room opened for his fingerprint. Inside, the air tasted like metal. He shut the door and shut the part of himself that could be seen. His voice, so practiced and controlled in public, grew sharper, eager, careless. He spoke to an unseen listener, a fixer on the encrypted line, perhaps, or to himself, victorious. He counted victories. He named the doctor who had falsified tests. He named the lab that had shredded samples. He walked through the schedule of new dosages, the timing of fainting spells, the way he kept the lady exhausted enough to consent to anything. He laughed about keeping the maid in fear with little fires, the broken latch, the shadow beneath a stair. He praised his own genius for handpicking board members loyal to him, and for arranging proxies that would place the whole of it in his hands by dawn. What he did not know was that the room carried his voice like a confession to the ballroom. The house system had a new vein, a thread sewn by small hands and patient hours. He was speaking into a hot mic, and the ballroom had begun to listen. At first, it was a whisper beneath the music, a second heartbeat crowding the violins. Then the screens around the hall flickered, and the curated montage of philanthropic images broke into lines of text, white on black. The audience saw purchase orders for pharmaceuticals that did not match prescriptions. They saw memos stamped confidential, detailing a contingency plan for incapacitation of an executive. They saw logs of security footage with frames missing on nights when the lady had stumbled, and the metadata trail that proved those frames had been cut. Then the voice rose like a dry tide through the speakers, crisp, unmistakable. He described how easy it had been, how no one looked behind silk. He boasted about a signature he could copy in his sleep. He told the silence that alarms had to be rehearsed, that accidents had to be plausible, that a woman can be edged out of her own life if you never let her sleep. Masks turned. The string players stopped at once, bows hovering like unanswered questions. A glass fell somewhere and shattered. Eyes found the lady on the steps. She did not tremble. The fog had thinned to a horizon line. Her hands rested on the rail, and under the mask her mouth was set, though her eyes were wet. She found the maid in the press of the crowd, saw the plain paper oval and the defiant chin, and gave the smallest nod. The husband burst back into the hall with the look of a man who has smelled smoke and cannot find the fire. His gaze flew to the screens, seized and flinched, then darted to the control booth by the orchestra. The maid stood there, one hand on the console. No one else moved. The crowd's hush was almost tender, a strange sympathy for the moment when a mask stops hiding and becomes a wall closing in. He lunged. He was faster than he looked, tragedy in a tailored suit, mouth pulled tight with a command he had used so often that it felt like a real answer. "Do not talk," he spat, the words a hiss, then a snarl, then a shout that cracked open to a scream. "Do not talk. Do not talk." He shoved through arms and startled shoulders, a streak of rage in a room of delicate beasts, and reached for the maid's throat, for the device, for anything that could still be his. He never reached her. Security flooded the space between them, men who had been paid to follow, and now acted as if their own names depended on it. They took him at the shoulders, the wrists, the waist. The knives of their radios barked orders that did not need to be repeated. He bucked and heaved. He growled in a voice that had charmed juries in his own head. He spun and tried to bite at hands that did not belong to him. In the end he sagged, not in defeat but in a kind of unmasked astonishment. The screens still rolled, the logs still spilled, his own voice still described a crime as if it were an art. The maid stepped back, breath fast, eyes wide and bright. A guard placed himself between her and any other danger the night might invent. She looked to the steps again. The lady removed her mask with a slow precision, as if not to startle a bird. Barefaced, she was both the woman everyone recognized and a stranger no one had met. She descended, one hand along the rail, the other too steady to be believed, and crossed the last stretch of floor without a tremor. When she reached the maid, she did not speak at first. She touched the girl's sleeve, just a brush, like a vow. The ballroom inhaled and held the breath. Somewhere, in a corner, a child of one of the guests began to cry, a thin, honest wail. The lady looked at the man twisted in the arms of those who once shadowed him like hounds, and then she looked at the screens where her own name flickered between lies and the truth. "Do not talk," he rasped one last time, but it had become a plea now, a prayer that the world might forget what it had just learned. The maid lifted her chin. Her voice was small and steel. "We do not have to. Your own voice will do." Behind them, the photographs of good deeds returned to the walls, but they looked different now, like masks that had been set aside. The music did not start again. It would not for a long time. What followed would be custody and statements, and a long procession of keys handed back to the hands that owned them. For the moment, there was only the silence that comes when a house changes owners without moving an inch, and the quiet knowledge that the worst night can sometimes be the one that gives you back your name. The sirens that morning sounded more like a verdict than a warning. The gates parted and uniforms swept through the courtyard, their radios hissing while the grey sky pressed down on the estate like a hand that would not let anything break free. The husband had made a habit of leaning on other people's fear the way one would lean on a cane, but the cane splintered at last. He stood on the front steps, lips pressed into a straight line, and laughed in a way that had no humor at all. The cuffs clicked, cold and final. The sound carried through the columned entrance hall where the staff had learned to breathe softly and to keep their eyes on the floor. Today, they watched. The lady stood at the top of the steps, the robe tied with an unflinching knot, the bruises of this season hidden by silk and resolve. When the officers guided him past her, he turned, wanting to say something that would wound again. She lifted her hand, and he fell silent, not for love, not for fear of the uniforms, but because something in her quiet had become unbreakable. The garage swallowed the patrol cars and the sirens faded, leaving only the whisper of the fountain and a rustle among the hedges that sounded like relief. Word traveled as quickly as fire jumps a dry fence. By noon the board had assembled on high floors, where carpets are so thick they mask footsteps, and where windows look down on the city like a stern parent. The room where decisions are made was usually filled with chilled water and colder smiles, yet as the lady entered, a hush settled that was not the old obedient quiet. It was attentiveness. There were dossiers and contracts on the table, but they were only paper. She spoke of contracts that were invisible, the ones we owe to each other, by virtue of conscience. She spoke of hidden punishments and the cost of silence. No one interrupted. In the past, she had waited for permission. Now she did not wait at all. When the vote was finished, she did not smile. She only breathed, a deep breath that seemed to belong to the whole building. Authority returned to her did not feel like a gift, but like the restoration of a limb. She thanked the room without bowing to it. With that, she requested one more act, not recorded in any charter. It concerned a rule that had hung like a portrait in every corridor. The board did not look at one another. Everyone understood what she meant. By evening, the estate lit up. Lamps glowed in the trees, and a platform was set at the bottom of the lawn where once auditors had stood and announced profits. The staff came quietly at first, shoulders still carrying the shape of earlier days. Then they clustered near the hedges, whispering. The residents of the town gathered beyond the iron fence, faces upturned, eyes bright in the dusk. The lady stepped into the lights. Her voice did not shake. She told the story with the simple bravery of a match being struck in a dark room. She spoke of a scheme as polished and poisonous as a glass of something meant to toast a future that would never come. She spoke of the night she would not have survived without a hand on her shoulder and a voice that said the one thing she had forbidden to all who worked under her. Talk. I am alive because someone refused to be quiet, she said, making room between each word so every ear could receive it. I am alive because one of our own put truth above fear. It is time this house learns from its bravest. This rule has no place here. She turned to the great oak in the center of the lawn, where a metal plaque had been bolted to the trunk. On that plaque a command had glinted for years like a blade. Don't talk. A groundskeeper stepped forward with a wrench. Bolts cracked loose. The plaque came down with a dull clang that sounded like a chain hitting the ground. Applause rose, unsure at first, then loud and wholehearted. A tide that climbed the steps and ran along the roof lines. The maid kept to the edge of the platform, every instinct telling her to stay small, to be nobody at all. Yet the lady reached for her hand and drew her into the light. The two of them stood side by side. The lady said, "This woman saved my life." She said it again, not to make a spectacle, but to make a record that no ledger could erase. She spoke of a new promise. The company would create a role with a single sacred purpose, to listen, to gather, to carry, to protect the words of those who keep the doors open and the rooms shining. No one would lose a job for telling the truth. No one would lose their name, because they spoke. The maid felt the crowd, the quiver of relief, the tremor of hope. The offer felt larger than new clothing could ever fit. It was not a promotion, it was a trust. She looked back toward the staff, saw shoulders lift, saw eyes meet that had avoided one another for years, saw a cook wipe a cheek with the back of a hand, saw a gardener nod slowly, as if counting the steps out of a maze. She did not know how to be the one to hold the megaphone of 1,000 rooms, but she knew how to knock on a door and say, "I am here to hear you." She had already done the hardest part. When the lights dimmed and the crowd drifted, she walked through the house that had once been a mouth that only ate. The hallways seemed wider. Rugs did not swallow her footsteps as they once had. She paused in the kitchen where a few of the crew stood with cups of tea, talking openly for the first time without flinching toward the pantry door. Someone pressed a paper bag into her hands. Still warm. For later, they said. She left by the front, not the service entrance. Outside, the evening smelled like rain and cut grass and something else she had not smelled in a long time, an uncomplicated tomorrow. The car the lady had sent was waiting, but she chose to walk down the hill to the road. The driver understood and followed slowly, a guardian presence without insistence. The town greeted her the way towns do, with nods and a few calls, with side glances that carried tenderness and pride. Her family's door was thinner than any door out on the estate. It opened with a creak that sounded like an old laugh. Arms wrapped around her and she folded into them, the bag warm against her chest, her heart warmer still. They asked if she was safe, and she nodded. They asked if she would stay, and she said yes, for a while, long enough to let fear drain from her bones like rain from a gutter. She spoke of the new work, of rooms where her presence would be permission for others to lift their chins. Eyes met hers and shone. They ate what the kitchen had sent. They told small stories, the little place filled with a big relief. When the night quieted, she looked at the ceiling and thought of walls, how some keep warmth in and others keep truth out. She had seen the strongest walls made of money, and rules crumble beneath one simple action. A voice held steady, a sentence spoken at the right time. She had been the one to break the rule that kept so many bent. Now the rule was gone, and the echo of that fall would carry further than any order ever had. In the morning, she would go back, not as a shadow, but as someone whose job was to invite other voices into the light. Tonight, she let the proof settle into her bones. Speaking up had cracked open doors gilded to look eternal. It had saved a life. It had brought her home.